Horror cinema doesn't often produce the kind of thing you'd hang on the wall, that's a given. Horror films, after all, are where filmmakers usually go to let their visual sensibilities hang loose, taking apart one victim at a time without a care for whether the viewer thinks this is insta-worthy. But even in this, there exists a baseline of acceptable imagery, a standard from which few filmmakers are willing to deviate, most often as a precondition to mass presentation. However, sometimes the director, the cinematographer, their effects team, and everyone else with a hand in the aesthetic makeup for a picture wants to colour outside the lines and go out of their way to make things as ugly as possible. 10 great horror movies that are ugly on purpose has of course been covered before, but now it's time for the next one. With that in mind, I'm Sean Ferry, What Culture Horror, and here are 10 more great horror movies that are ugly on purpose. Number 10, Death Proof, 2007. It stops, it starts, it stutters. It's Quentin Tarantino's ode to exploitation cinema of yore. It's Death Proof. Presented alongside an array of fake film trailers created by some of cinema's best, but which look as though they were made in someone's basement, the movie is an all-out homage to the kind of scrappy filmmaking that history has all but left behind. And Kurt Russell is front and centre as a stunt driver with a fatal case of misogyny. Russell's history in several classic John Carpenter films undoubtedly snagged him this role, and Carpenter's old aesthetic speaks to the kind of movie Death Proof aims to be. Such a meeting of minds was this collaboration that Tarantino abandoned much of his usual practice and let Russell freewheel his performance throughout the film, dropping in lines here and there and channeling Marlon Brando. The results of this process are many, scattered all throughout the film, but by far the most memorable is the smile down the barrel of the cinema, breaking the fourth wall, just for the hell of it. This faux pas is far from where the overall unsightliness of the film ends. However, as the effects are schlocky and OTT, there are cigarette burns, negative dirt, and the real changes prominent throughout. Everything looks like it needs a good wash. It certainly ain't pretty. Number 9. The Dead Don't Die, 2019. It's not every day you get an absurdist zombie horror comedy from an indie auteur, Jim Jarmusch. But when you do, you can bet it comes with a cast list stacked to the rafters with just about anyone imaginable. The small town of Centerville is gradually overrun by the Walking Dead, while those not infected or otherwise incapacitated prevaricate and ponder and take their sweet time deciding what to do. Adam Driver leads the confusion as Police Chief Cliff Robertson, heading a cast that includes Bill Murray, Chloe Sevigny, Tilda Swinton, Tom Waits, Danny Glover, Iggy Pop, and Selena Gomez. But while audiences flock to the director's vampire two-hander Only Lovers Left Alive, this one has been left behind, and it might have been something to do with the aesthetics. See, zombie movies aren't meant to be attractive affairs, but Jarmusch tacks as close to his low-budget sensibilities as possible. Where Only Lovers was all Tom Hiddleston and Tilda Swinton draping themselves across scenes and making love to the camera, The Dead Don't Die is an intentional mishmash of styles. It takes some pretty leery practical effects and mashes them against an array of weird wigs, high contrast makeup, and even an old-fashioned CG UFO, framing some major actors against the kind of low-rent genre horror backdrop we rarely get to see them in. Number 8. The Poughkeepsie Tapes, 2007. John Eric Dowdall's brief and brutal documentary horror, The Poughkeepsie Tapes, sets up the case of a serial killer from Poughkeepsie, New York, as if it's the real deal. So far, so every other found footage movie. But rather than withholding of its subjects and objects through misdirection, shaky cam and all manner of stylistic tricks, an element so essential to its filmic forebears, Poughkeepsie Tapes bites right into the meat of its cruelties with a cache of the killer's own snuff films. A blend of talking heads, CCTV, news reports and footage from the titular tapes, the picture is anything but pretty, with production values that would make Tommy Wiseau cringe. But this is precisely the point of the whole endeavour. In order to create a believable facsimile of a sadistic serial killer, Dowdall and crew start to act like the real deal. The quality of the tapes ranges from grainy VHS to barely coherent, but throughout every clip and reel there is a very convincing sense of danger. Number 7. Evil Dead 2, 1987. Director Sam Raimi specialises in dynamic, in-your-face filmmaking that focuses on the physical details far more than necessary. Just look at how he worked his camera on the human subjects in the Spider-Man movies. This is all rooted in his indie origins, which required him to create an energetic and unignorable style to stand out from the crowd. And of course, this goes right back to the Evil Dead. While all the Evil Dead movies are a sight for sore eyes, Evil Dead 2, which takes us back to the cabin in the woods, which Ash, played by of course Bruce Campbell, his girlfriend and a gaggle of deadites, has a special place in the franchise's ugly canon for one important reason. Despite having about 10 times the budget than on his previous film, which was clobbered together for less than $400,000, Raimi didn't use the cash for frivolities like improving the similitude of his special effects. No, to really make his mark on horror cinema, Raimi doubled down and shot the second movie with all of his usual tricks, Sam-cam shots, POV chases, dolly zooms, you name it, and B-movie effects. Cementing what was coming to be his unique aesthetic style, Raimi used the budget to create even more monsters in the mould of the first one, with gross details and rubbery faces. None of it looks real, none of it looks catwalk ready, but that is the point. Number 6. Velvet Buzzsaw 2019. Art world satire Velvet Buzzsaw boasts an expansive cast, a decent budget, some pretty potent ideas, and both the director and star of runaway indie sensation Nightcrawler, Dan Gilroy, and Jake Gyllenhaal. And yet it manages to be pretty ugly. But that's the point. The film revolves around a series of paintings that enter the orbit of a bisexual LA art critic played by Gyllenhaal, and his circle of snobs, curators, pretentious artists, and hangers-on. But the works belong to a deceased artist, Vetril Dees, and while the furore surrounding his undiscovered talent grows and grows, so do the sinister and deadly happenings that seem to occur in the painting's presence. The artwork that these people fawn over is at best benign, and at worst pretty hideous. While this would be commentary enough, the new paintings are a special kind of ugly, featuring deformed people that reflect the art critic's world. Yet that's far from where it ends. In contrast to the high art setup and setting, the monstrous apparitions emerging from the paintings are hideous, the paint that infects the critics is literally 2D, and the kills are sloppy, bloody, and really at odds with the primary aesthetics of the world the violence is entering. Velvet Buzzsaw satire may not be as sharp and considered as in other recent hits like Ruben Östlund's The Square or Todd Field's Tar, but it offers a visual thematic undertaking all of its own. Number 5. Possum 2018. The British have something of a monopoly on the dark and dreary, particularly when presenting everyday life on the lower rungs of society's greasy ladder. But add an overbearing element of psychological horror to a terrifyingly real depiction of trauma, and something like Possum is born, something you can't wait to put back in its box. Returning to his run-down childhood home in Norfolk, disgraced puppeteer Philip, played by Sean Harris, settles in for several of the most harrowing experiences of his life. Living in the company of his abusive uncle, Philip becomes unhinged and, with nothing more socially meaningful than the company of his horrendous spider-legged puppet Possum, he begins to experience flashbacks, hallucinations, and an all-round sense of distress that finds its way into every frame of the film. Director Matthew Holness and his sets, effects, and costumes teams did their darndest to make absolutely every element of Possum's mise-en-scène grubby and worn, marking the miseries of Philip's cold reality with an aesthetic that would make Trainspotting cry. Number 4. Planet Terror 2007. The counterpart to Tarantino's Death Proof, Robert Rodriguez's Planet Terror was made with the same agenda and filmmaking sensibilities, harking back to a bygone time of cheap, ugly cinema created by filmmakers on a shoestring budget. Despite not really taking off as part of the so-called Grindhouse double bill, Planet Terror nonetheless shares a lot of the values and approaches prized by its stablemate Death Proof, and for the most part managing to make a $23 million budget look like it was held together with sellotape and PVA. Granted, a good portion of the budget likely went towards the stars, Rose McGowan, Josh Brolin, Bruce Willis, Fergie, and the action set pieces, but Rodriguez and his team really went out of their way to make this one as ugly as possible. Heavy film grain is present throughout, added in post rather than shot on old celluloid. Stock footage is spliced into scenes. Jumps, sudden cuts, a shuddering camera effect are used to make everything seem damaged, worn and shot in single takes. And the effects are mostly practical, crafted to look as sticky, slimy, pulsating and visceral as possible. Number 3. Deerskin 2019. There are no substitutes when it comes to indie comedy horror and the height of absurdity. French filmmaker Quentin Dupieux is the reigning champ, and rightly so. Desperately underappreciated and underexposed, his movie Deerskin locates its horror in the comfort of a deerskin jacket, which seizes its host, Georges, played by Jean Dujardin, in more than just a midlife crisis. Consumed by his newfound killer style, he embarks on a journey to become, or at least appear as, an amateur filmmaker. But But the jacket isn't having any of it, and soon has him rounding up all of the local jackets for destruction and slaying their owners. Dupieux has made a career out of surrealism, comedy, horror, and all the other places in between, and while Deerskin is one of his best, it manages all the horrors and hilarity without the jacket ever visibly coming to life, allowing Georges and, of course, Dujardin to do the heavy lifting. Now, there's no denying the film has the look of its budget. The costuming is bulky and odd and, well, kind of old, and the kills are mostly filmed from a camcorder. But all of this adds not just to the aesthetic set by the deerskin jacket itself, but Georges' desire to be an amateur filmmaker, with no idea what he's doing. It's a commentary on the filmmaking process via the filmmaking process, and a master like Dupieux knows exactly what he's doing here. Number 2, Mad God 2021. A tough film to characterise, other than to say it's a stop motion from hell. Phil Tippett's 30-year labour of love, Mad God, takes us into the depths of an adjacent reality where the earth is wretched and war-torn and permanently screaming in pain. It is such an impressive piece of visual art and testament to everything Tippett and his volunteers put into it, but also a stomach-churning, toe-curling, nails-on-blackboard watch that doesn't pair well with friends and a pizza. Painstakingly crafting every small detail, Tippett had a vision of true horror for the film, unlike pretty much anything we've ever seen before. And thankfully, his form allowed him to render everything imaginable as his nameless main character descends through the levels of the earth, but which we really understand to be representations of the worst possible reality, one built from pain and suffering. In short, hell. And by the end, you very much would like to rinse your eyes out, if not for the fear of them turning to slime in the process. Number 1. Naked Lunch, 1991. Adapted from William S. Burroughs' nigh illegible novel of the same name, Naked Lunch sees David Cronenberg take everything he's known for and turn it up to 11. A body horror of the finest order, the movie follows bug exterminator Bill Lee, played by Peter Weller, who gets hooked on his own bug-killing powder and a drug made from centipedes designed to get him off it, both of which take him on a physical, metaphysical and hallucinatory journey out of the States and into a state. A stand-in for Burroughs himself, Bill's adventures mimic some of the drug odysseys the author went on while writing Naked Lunch, winding up abroad in a mysterious Mediterranean city with only a mutating bug-like typewriter for any kind of permanent company. And although he reins in Burroughs' text's lack of structure and narrative, Cronenberg's attention to detail is immaculate. Recreating some of the most evocative passages from the book while adding his own flair, the director realises a consistent stream of grim imagery on screen, with unexplainable fleshy apparitions, shape-shifting centipedes, human bodysuits, mugwumps, beetles, and fluids of every kind. No expense is spared in the ugliness of this flick, and so effective is the craft that you'll probably never want to watch it again.